Thank you both of our flash presentations. They were both really interesting. Cyber war, clash of the paradigms, cyber war versus cyber law enforcement, very interesting. And then the power of indictments beyond whether you can get arrests, what other value do they have? I'd like to welcome to the stage the panelists for our next session, and moderating this discussion will be someone who is just really has a deep well of knowledge and international knowledge on the malicious cyber actions that are going out there. Former and retired Ambassador Gina Abercrombie-Winstanley is a 30-year veteran of the U.S. Foreign Service, and I think over the last week, all of America has a greater appreciation for the professionalism of our Foreign Service officers who go overseas and just how important a job they do and how amazing they are when they are put under fire. Ambassador Abercrombie-Winstanley is also on our Third Way Cyber Enforcement Advisory Board, which we're deeply appreciative of, and she was a foreign policy advisor at one point for the U.S. Cyber Command. So if the next panel could come to the stage, please. I'm going to leave this in your able hands.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Okay, a lot of energy in the room there. All right. I had a crisp, incisive introduction for this panel, but this morning's speakers have allowed me to shorten it even more. I'm going to say three things: millions of attacks, billions of dollars lost, 6 arrests. Shall we begin? All right. We are joined by an outstanding group of experts who bring real-world experience to the questions that have been laid out today. Who are these bad actors? What works, what doesn't in our quest to stop them? And what should be done for victims, and what can we all usefully do? I'd like to introduce Eileen Decker, who is the president of the Los Angeles Police Commission and former U.S. Attorney for the Central District of California. Jim Baker, to my right, other right, Director of National Security and Cybersecurity, R Street Institute, and the former General Counsel of the FBI. Ram Bouchard, Vice President and Chief Technology Officer for Government Solutions of FireEye. And Kristen Judge, President for Cybercrime Support Networks. So I'd like to start with you, Ron. Would you please give us a quick overview of the types of bad cyber actors that are out there? Who is law enforcement looking for?
Sure, no problem. Thanks everyone for the time today. I don't think it's going to come as a surprise that there's a spectrum of motivations and actors out there for this audience in cyberspace. I think if I had to quantify the challenge we're facing now versus 5 or 10 years ago, is that the distinctions between and amongst these motivations and groups have really blurred quite significantly. So if you look up on the basic chart we have here in terms of motivations around hacktivism or information operations or deception, those are all bleeding over into state-sponsored acts of cyber crime or cyber warfare, depending on your definition. The other challenge we're seeing, of course, is the other way around. We've recently, publicly provided evidence of nation states using cyber as a means of financial gain. So, is that a crime, or is it a nation-state attack, or is it both? And so the big challenge we have in this spectrum is, as more and more actors come into this space, both from the purely criminal side as well as the government-sponsored or at least government tacit approval, you start to really have a significant challenge in attribution and determining underlying motivations. And of course, the other significant, I think, threat we're facing in this space is the proliferation of cyber weapons. So as nations have come into this domain more aggressively over the past few years and used nation-grade cyber weapons, those almost immediately become available to the broader marketplace. And we've seen that over and over again in the waves of ransomware attacks we've witnessed in the United States here against smaller state and municipalities, really trying to defend themselves against fairly sophisticated tools that only a few years ago were completely secret and classified by very, very sophisticated governments in the world. The other chart to just, of course, paint the picture is the mapping we have as a company as FireEye. And of course, we only have one slice of visibility into the global landscape. But up here, you'll see 42, I believe, 41 or 42 named what we consider advanced persistent threat groups, along with some unknown groups that we also track as significant threat actors. That's a small slice of the hundreds we track as unknown. In other words, we haven't made a determination yet as to where we're comfortable making an attribution determination. The other chart I could try to put up on a screen, but you'd go blind trying to look at it, is all the countries that we are aware of, either publicly stating or in what we can discern from activity to some extent are either investing in or have built cyber capabilities and are using those capabilities at least at an espionage level globally. So the landscape of actors is obviously expanding rapidly. The tooling available has exploded, and the overlap of motivations and means is really becoming a significant challenge for anyone to really track in a centralized way.
Okay, you did not cheer us up, but thank you. All right. Eileen, how do you measure the size of the problem of cybercrime, and why does an accurate measurement matter?
Well, first, we don't have an accurate measurement. It's very complex. You've heard a little bit this morning. In fact, Senator Warner, I think it was, who said that the Senate committee structure did not match the need for modern cyber problems or modern problems. And I would add that our current system of counting crimes does not match the need of modern crime in terms of we're not collecting enough information on modern crime problems. But I think our first issue, it is a chronically underreported crime. Many of you already know that. Many of you have been a victim of a cyber crime, and I would venture to ask how many of you actually went into your local police department and reported that crime. One. Two, excellent. Three, I did actually as well. But most individuals, most businesses, don't report it. Why? You report it maybe to your bank, your credit card company, your social media platforms, and your expectation, and most people expect they will handle it. But more fundamental than that is our system of collecting information on crime. The Uniform Crime Reporting System was built or developed initially in the 1920s. And it is a wonderful program that collects important data on crime, but it was based upon that 1929 vision by the International Association of Chiefs of Police of what was important to society at that time. They were murder, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, larceny, auto theft, and arson joined the list later on. Those are called Part 1 crimes, and you may wonder, why are you getting so granular on this? But you all know that your local police departments are reporting on these crimes. This is what they report to the FBI. They also do report some Part 1, Part 2 crimes as well. But fundamentally, this list of crimes is still what's important to local law enforcement today. This is what drives them when they come out every year with their press conference on crime in your city or your locality, when the mayor and your police chief get up and say crime has gone down X number of percent. This is the crime they're counting. They're not counting cybercrime. When you talk about CompStat or you hear CompStat being used by all these police departments, what are they analyzing? What numbers are they analyzing? Those crimes as defined in 1929 as being the core crimes we were concerned with as a society. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with those crimes. They're very important to all of our societies today and well-being, but it doesn't capture cybercrime. Now, there is hope through the FBI and with the Association of Police Chiefs. They have been developing, and actually it's being implemented around the country, a new system of counting, more granular, more information. It's the National Incident-Based Reporting System, NIBRS for short, where it's actually 52 crimes, but they're still fundamentally focused on street crimes. But they do have a broader list. But with many of those, the local law enforcement is able to add a component of it happened through the use of cyber. But of that list of 52, only one is specifically relating to hacking and computer crimes. So there's a lot of work to be done to ensure within this system more cyber crime will be counted, but it is a basis for hope. I will say the FBI, you heard earlier, Mika mentioned the IC3 program, the Internet Crime Complaint Center, which is an online program. Rather than local law enforcement reporting crime up, it's a voluntary system where victims of crime can go online and report the crime. And the idea is that the FBI will piece together what happened in your jurisdiction, my jurisdiction, yours, and they can see patterns and then send it to law enforcement to investigate, or the FBI can. It is a voluntary reporting system, but it does collect significant information that we can't ignore. Since its inception, 4 million reports have been made each year, about 350,000. But what it really provides are more the trends of what's happening. So for example, in the last report issued, business email compromise was a big issue. Extortion complaints, things like denial of service, extortion, impersonation, data breaches, and tech support fraud. So what this does is it doesn't give us exact numbers of what is happening, but it tells us the trends, and that, of course, is very important. But the FBI itself has estimated only about 10% of cyber crimes are collected through this database. Private companies do their work, academia does their work, think tanks do their work, all collecting a little piece of the information. But where does that leave us? It leaves us with this patchwork of information, but not precise information on the nature and extent of cybercrime. And why is that important? Which I think was your question. Policymakers rely on it, funding relies on it, resource development training, how to tackle the problem, all of that is driven through the law enforcement community based on the data they have. So them lacking in the data results in them not also putting in all the resources necessary to address the problem, and for policymakers not dedicating enough resources to address the problem.
Yeah. All right, important. Jim, since we have this challenge and understand now that when we get reports of crime going down, it doesn't include cybercrime.
Not always.
Not always, okay. Can you talk a bit about the tools, the training, the cooperation, and the transparency that are needed for federal enforcement to move forward on this?
Mm-hmm. Well, as others have noted, I mean, the key thing here at the end of the day comes down to money. Mm-hmm. It's money. It's your money. It's out of your pockets. We need to take money and spend it on this problem. I mean, that's basically what it amounts to. In order to make sure that across the country, at the federal, state, and local levels, that the people trying to stop this have the adequate systems to deal with the level of sophistication of the threat from these threat actors, to even figure out what's going on, to be able to have the training. The training is critical. The training is expensive. Why? Because there's so few people can actually give the kind of training that you need to be able to deal with the threats at this level. The systems to absorb the data that exists, to not only absorb it, but then to analyze it and to make sense out of it, and then to be able to act on it. All of that needs to be done. In addition, we need really it's a financial issue in part. It's also a cultural issue and a legal issue, I think, with respect to information sharing. Information sharing among the federal law enforcement and national security entities, and sharing appropriately given those different authorities, and then sharing with between them and state and local, having local authorities share it appropriately, and then having all of those governmental entities be able to share it in a lawful, constitutional way with the private sector, and then have the private sector share it back. Because different people, different entities have different views of the problem, different, a number of people looking at the problem through a straw. Well, you need everybody to look at the problem holistically. And I think those are some of the challenges that we face with respect to this area. But at the end of the day, it all comes back to money.
Okay. Money and information sharing, it sounds like. Do you have thoughts on how to address that stovepiping challenge that we've been dealing with for so long?
I mean, part of it is money and be able to build systems that can absorb all that. Part of it, as I say, is cultural, because law enforcement agencies, when they obtain information, they want to hold on to it because you don't know what you're going to do with it, and it may turn out to be evidence of a case, and you don't want to reveal it to the bad guys, and so on. I think from the private sector, there also are, and I'm not saying these things are illegitimate, I'm just saying they exist. From the private sector, they also have concerns about sharing information with law enforcement. Can we share this? The laws that apply in this area, as others have noted, it's a complex patchwork of overlapping and confusing laws, and it's hard for folks, I think, in the private sector to assess what they can and can't do with a significant degree of confidence, so that they can be assured that they're not going to be violating the law, opening themselves up to some type of either criminal prosecution or lawsuit or whatever. And then it is partly cultural, I think, because cyber breaches in particular indicate some level of failure within an organization, and organizations generally don't like to examine or even acknowledge their failures, and so they want to keep those close hold for a variety of reasons. And so getting over sort of that, getting over some of the cultural issues that are related to the law and are related to the inadequate resources, it's the whole thing is complicated, and there's no silver bullet to sort of enable us to move forward in a cohesive and effective way.
All right, I'm going to come back to that, so we'll put a tag in that. Kristen, can you talk to us a bit about what do victims need to help them deal with and recover from a cyber compromise of their data or other attacks?
Great, thank you so much. Thank you to the Third Way team for the great work they've done. When I read the To Catch a Cyber Criminal, I thought that was the research paper that was written to supplement or to defend all of the work of our nonprofit. So the Cybercrime Support Network, we are the voice of the cybercrime victims, the small businesses and the consumers who are being impacted by the millions and not being counted. So we are some good news. So all of the things we've been hearing about the problems of information sharing and knowing what's happening and putting a price tag on this, thanks to all of our partners in the federal government, state and local law enforcement who we've been working with, we're building the national hotline for cybercrime victims to call, to report, recover, and reinforce their security. 3 countries are ahead of us. Canada, the UK, and Israel already have one number to call. And we're going to be live in about 15 states by the end of next year. Currently, residents in Rhode Island can call 211, West Michigan, and Orlando, Florida, and get help with reporting to currently the IC3. About 50% of the victims that come to us want to report to the IC3 or to government or to law enforcement. So we've just secured funding from the Department of Homeland Security to build a prototype and feasibility study on information sharing of the threats to state and local government. So citizens will call us and we will let law enforcement know what's happening. We will have those clusters and we will push the information out instead of law enforcement having to query it. So until we give the victims a voice by counting them, we can't get the money, we can't get the cooperation. So our nonprofit is working with federal, state, and local, public and private sector to make sure we count the victims and give them a voice. Then all of these other problems can be addressed. But this is an economic crisis, and no one's really putting a dollar figure on it. We're all guessing. Maybe 1 in 3 Americans are a victim, maybe they're losing about $20 billion a year. But until we count them and give them a voice, nothing can move forward in Congress or on the training level or on the staffing level. So we're going to count the victims, and then we can start working all the rest of this. So we're really excited to work with our partners at DHS and our 211 partners across the country and follow the models. But we also understand that until the victims have somewhere local to go to get help, we hear from victims, I reported here, I reported there, no one knew what to do, I called 5 places, because they're calling the wrong place. So we want to get them into the system through 211 and then get them where they need to go. I'll close on this part with, in 1996, when we did the Violence Against Women Act, Senator Joe Biden at the time got $27 million for victims of domestic violence. And we had bathroom campaigns. Women my age will remember. We counted the victims. They started coming out. We started building shelters and places, and people were trained to counsel them. And within 6 years, there was $477 million to support the Violence Against Women Act. I think that's what's going to happen with cybercrime, but we just need to get started.
Excellent, okay. Back to you, Ron. I'd like to ask you to go back to the issue of cooperation and coordination across state, federal, and international jurisdictions. What's your best case scenario for how that should go?
Best case scenario, it's a challenging environment to work in. Obviously, as Jim mentioned, there are reasons for keeping certain pieces of information close hold, right? Depending on what you're doing with that, if there's a legitimate government need from a countermeasures perspective or from a law enforcement perspective. But I do think the opposite isn't necessarily the right approach either, which is to say share everything everywhere. Because one, what we've seen consistently is a real challenge by the recipients of that information to do something useful with it and to contextualize it in a way that's meaningful for their particular risk posture, business, environment, et cetera. And two, again, a lot of organizations, believe it or not, despite the fact that we recognize that we're not seeing everything or sharing everything, we're beginning to hit data saturation in a lot of places that I work with customers, where they already have so much information they don't know what to do with it. That's their own generated plus shared plus purchased threat intelligence information. So I'm not sure that more information is the answer. Maybe more curated or more tailored information sharing, or more meaningful collaboration in terms of what to do and how to prioritize. So again, if we're thinking about this from an international or even a U.S. federal and down to state and local, I think you're going to have some really hard discussions around what are the priorities. Are we here to protect critical infrastructure? Yes, probably, right? Are we here to protect key businesses and interests from an economic perspective? Maybe. Are we here to protect individual citizens and privacy? Maybe, but you're going to have to start to make some trade-offs because we probably can't do it all, at least not at this stage, or at least not well. So I think if I'm going to think about a framework here, there has to be some sort of prioritization and collaboration and really at an operational level, not just an information exchange or information sharing level. And then the other piece I think that really we have to unlock in a bigger way is public-private collaboration and partnership. And I say that not as a commercial interest, but really because if you try to build this all as its own, thing within a government entity, regardless of how much funding you can get, you can't solve the problem, right? The reach just isn't there, and you're going to be spending decades to build that infrastructure. So I feel, despite the failings of the security vendor space over the past 20 years, I think there's enough out there if we do it correctly that you can really gain a lot of leverage in a partnering environment. But it requires a legal and legislative framework and a regulatory framework that allows for that collaboration to happen in a meaningful way. Today, there's a lot of liability, right, on both sides of the equation in me as a security vendor trying to get government data out to my customers in a way that the government's comfortable with in sharing, or vice versa, trying to get meaningful data back from my customers that can advantage or help the various legal authorities within the United States or internationally in going after these guys. I'm, in many cases, handcuffed in sharing that information, right, because of the legal structures I have to operate under from a privacy perspective. So I think if we can figure out ways to break down those barriers, at least even to a small extent, I think we can have huge gains without having to necessarily invest hundreds of millions, billions of dollars in new infrastructure, because a lot of it's there. It's just a question of how do we bring it together in a more effective way as a partnership.
I must say, you're reminding me of my early days working in counterterrorism, where we had so much information.
Right.
So, and the stovepiping and managing the information in an effective fashion.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot of analogies to that situation, both in the information sharing, the distribution of information, and also problem solving together, sharing the technological knowledge and working together, perhaps even through fusion centers and things like that. But you're right, there's a lot of analogies to that time period.
Which suggests some framework and is there in place from one challenge to another. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So Eileen, continuing with you, I'd like to have you talk to us a little bit about how much energy we should have focused on successful prosecutions and why. Why?
Well, prosecutions are very important. You've heard from a number of different speakers, and I'll put a caveat on that, of course, that we have to be very careful with the amount of information that is disclosed. The issue that a lot of the speakers have brought up today is we don't want to give away all of our tools on how we are putting together cases. And Garrett earlier spoke about the importance this can have to foreign policy, and I thought all of his points were very well taken and relevant to your question. But prosecutions are fundamentally important because, as you know, if we don't tackle this problem, even at the early stages, it's just going to get demonstrably worse. Victims are relying on prosecutors, law enforcement to investigate this. Suspects, I think as Mika said earlier, will just act with a free hand if they feel like there's all reward and no risk. But also, fundamentally, we have to train our law enforcement officers on how to do these cases. I was responsible for a lot of these cases in the Central District of California, and you don't want to start with the Sony hack case. Perhaps, the most enormous of many cases that have been prosecuted, and in your spare time you can go online and read the criminal complaint. It's only about 180 pages, but it details how law enforcement very meticulously came about to develop the evidence in that case. And it's very important that law enforcement all along the way is working on cases so that they train to be able to do a case of that magnitude. That case took 4 years to investigate and hopefully close the door on the question of who attacked Sony, and as well as other cyber crimes like the Bank of Bangladesh. But at the same time, we have to start working these cases. Law enforcement needs the training, they need the experience. Prosecutors need the training and the experience. Judges who traditionally, and when they were practicing law, were not dealing with cybercrime. They also have to be invested in, learn the techniques, understand the law in this area. And as we build these cases, we can get better at this. We can train more law enforcement officers. It can become part of their career track, as opposed to today, more so in local law enforcement than in federal. Getting officers willing to do this work can be a challenge. It takes time to get trained, as Jim mentioned, it takes a long time. They have to dedicate years of their life. They're frequently concerned about not moving up the ladder within their own local law enforcement agency, not getting promoted on time, and we have to build ways to incentivize them to spend large portions on their careers on these issues and train, learn it, and then constantly apply it. And that's one way, in addition to the counting, which I totally agree with, one way we can tackle this problem.
Okay. We talked a little bit about breaches and the pros and cons of admitting them. I know, having been a victim of data compromise and being misrepresented on social media and other events, that I range between frustration and anger, learning about breaches, learning about compromises months, years after it's happened with companies. So can you talk a little bit about what goes into the calculus of that and what should companies be doing? I know we talked a little bit about it, and please, as we go along, others add in. Go ahead.
Well, to focus on, I'll focus on companies. Look, I'm just going to be a broken record here. Everything comes back to money at the end of the day, but I'll work my way to that point. But if you think about the issue just with respect to an individual, right, to make it a little simpler in some sense. So when you or anybody else is breached, you should report it. You should report it because you need help. You need help figuring out how to unscramble the mess that these bad guys have created in your life, and you also need help to protect yourself and make sure that they're not able to get in again and do something even worse potentially. One of the things that comes up, though, and I'll take this from the individual case up to the corporations, that concerns people is, okay, I'm from law enforcement. You've said that your computer was hacked. Can I have access to your computer? Well, what else might you have on your computer that you might not want law enforcement to either look at all or to have, and what's going to happen, and is this computer going to end up in an evidence room somewhere, like Raiders of the Lost Ark sitting in the back, right? That's what people are afraid of. And so, and like, what is going to happen with my information? What's law enforcement going to do with it, and so on. And so that's then, you can extrapolate from that to corporations. They have the same concerns. And so this is where I think it's incumbent upon law enforcement to, and I think there has been a significant change in how law enforcement thinks about these problems over the years. Initially, it was more like just, there's been a crime, we're going to grab the evidence. And what needs to happen is that law enforcement at all levels must think of the victims as victims. Law enforcement is used to dealing with victims of a whole range of heinous crimes, right? And they're very sensitized to doing that. I'm not saying they do a perfect job in every instance, but especially like at the FBI, we think about victims. We think about how to protect victims. We think about how to help victims after they've suffered, right? And to help them move forward. And so that's the key thing. And if law enforcement approaches it that way, both from well, at every level, really, how they interact with the victim corporation, then the relationship can be different from the outset, the approach can be different, the requests for information, for data, for access to computers can be different, more tailored. It's just a completely different approach that can provide some reassurance to the victim corporation. Having said that, there is inherent risk in dealing with law enforcement. There just is. Because you are, to some extent, losing control of the information that has been shared. That is just a reality. And it's something, the other reality is that in these kinds of situations, nothing is going to happen unless the general counsel signs off on it. Mm-hmm. Usually in consultation with a big law firm that they have to pay a lot of money to. And so, because it's just there's so much risk that other executives within the corporation are not going to do anything, I think, unless the GCs sign off on it. Therefore, law enforcement has to, ahead of time, go out and build relationships with the general counsels of the companies. I think too often they focus on the security people, on the cyber people, and so on. But at the end of the day, if there's a breach, nothing's going out the door unless the GC signs off on it. And so I think sort of having this different approach to companies and understanding how they work and what their incentives are will help law enforcement, federal, state, and local level, engage in a better way, in a more effective way with the victims.
Okay. All right.
If I could pick
please.
up on that, just a small anecdote to prove Jim's point, and to go back to the Sony hack case, which obviously was an emergency, and Sony actually had the phone number for the relevant FBI agent, got them involved very easy. And while it was a very tragic and horrible situation for any corporation to go through, in the aftermath of that, and to Sony's absolute credit and to their CEO's credit, their general counsel's credit after the hack, they arranged for a meeting of CEOs in the entertainment industry in Los Angeles. CEOs, their counsel, all came, and they shared their experience with all of them and explained to them why they needed to get the FBI in very early. It drives home the point that you make that they, of course, Sony knew that the only way to get through to everybody and to help protect their industry was to share with them their experiences, and they did, and I will say absolutely to Sony's credit for doing that, because they overcame the hesitancy of sharing some rather dramatic information that hasn't even hit the news about how it all happened, and being very forthright with their competitors, but understanding the importance to the industry of staying healthy, that when one is attacked, others will be too. And they shared their information about dealing with law enforcement and encouraging them to get involved on the front end.
Excellent. Go ahead.
I wanted to offer a few thoughts along the same lines. So I think there's still a very large disconnect, if we're being honest with ourselves, on where to place blame, right? And I've heard a couple of these discussions here and in other forums of how much responsibility and accountability do we place on the organizations or the individuals to protect their own systems and data to a standard of care that can vary quite widely depending on what industry you're in, or personally, I don't think we have a definition of what that standard of care should look like. Versus, the criminal element or the aggressor here, which in some cases can be fairly petty crime or can go all the way up to literally the most sophisticated intelligence organizations on the planet. So now if I take that frame, how do I determine a disclosure regime that makes sense, right? In Sony's case, they're the victim of a very sophisticated and aggressive, right, nation state. And similarly with central bank attacks and some of these very large SWIFT attacks. But Mark Warner was up here earlier, I believe, talking about Equifax as an example. And I think in that conversation, there's been a fairly, the positioning I hear in general is, well, their standard of care was not high enough. They were mostly to blame. And that's kind of I'm not placing my own judgment on that. I'm just saying that's kind of the conversation I heard around that breach. So I think when you enter that regime as any kind of organization on any spectrum, and we don't have a definition of due diligence and care or a standard that can be applied, and we have a very wide swath of public perception about how you're going to be perceived if you do disclose, you get the reaction that Jim mentioned, which is everything will be close hold unless we absolutely have to disclose it, which does harm, I think, generally speaking, to a response and to actually having consequences enacted on these actors. I think we're still at the baseline level of figuring this out. I mean, and we've got a long way to go. The other thing I'll say is cyber tends to be different in terms of, we frame a lot of this conversation in the realm of physical, crime or violent crime. It's much more removed than that. In many, many cases, yes, you might have a personal experience where somebody took your identity and it's kind of a hassle, but we're insured for a lot of this. We've got big hassle. But in
Yes.
many, many cases,
Thank
I
you.
can give you examples of organizations where, intellectual property was stolen, very valuable intellectual property, but if you tell them a certain organization or entity took that, they might look at it and say, okay, not really going to be impactful to my customers, not really going to hit my bottom line. It's not immediate. It doesn't have the immediacy of a violent crime or even, in some cases, a burglary in your home. So I think you face that challenge as well in this space of it's very remote. You're never going to see the perpetrator face to face. In fact, they're probably half a world away. It's very abstract in many, many cases as to what actually occurred. And there's always going to be an element of embarrassment, I think. As Jim mentioned, even individually, if you had to admit that you opened an email, a phishing attack and you clicked on a link, or your password was password 123, we all could do better here. But the question is how much better should we do as organizations or individuals to defend ourselves versus how much more, consequence do we need to really put on the adversary here? And I think that's the part that's kind of missing in the conversation right now.
Yeah, no, I'll agree with that. Well, I want the audience to get their questions ready, and I want to close out this first round with Kristen to get the victim's perspective on this.
Yeah, I would say it's probably pretty
representation.
personal. No offense to your comments there, but I met a grandmother who lost $250,000 in a romance scam, who's 78 years old and now needs to start working. That's very personal. It hurts a lot, and it has ruined her life. So, and you were saying too that, identity theft, that can take a year to clean up. And people, especially domestic violence victims or folks who are elders who are having their identity stolen by family members, it is traumatic, emotionally charging, and devastating financially. So there's so many impacts to the individuals that are separate from, the corporations, they have an IT folks, they can bring in Mandiant, they can clean it up, look at the bottom line. But when you're talking about individuals and small businesses who are impacted, it's a lot different. There's emotional, there's physical, there's financial issues that we need to be taking care of. And one of the things that we saw in our research, 91% of the victims that we talked to wanted to report to law enforcement. 91%. In any research, there's a lot of researchers in the room, that's a really high number. But they wrote that they didn't want to do it because they thought the bad guy would get caught. They wanted law enforcement to know because they thought maybe they'd catch him for the next person. They know I'm not going to get my money back, but darn it, I want law enforcement to know about this so they can do something about it. And I have an issue when we talk about we need more training for law enforcement, which we are doing with 911 dispatchers. 911 gets a lot of calls for romance scams, identity theft, and now they can send them to fraudsupport.org, which is our website, which is why we created it. Law enforcement asked us to have a website people could go to learn how to recover, because when you're working in 911, you don't like to turn people away. And then also, instead of just saying we need to train law enforcement, we need bodies. We need more cyber folks that are full-time. You can't say to our county sheriff in Washtenaw County, now with your small staff that you already have, you need to also become experts and get people that are working on these things, 10 hours a week each officer. Like, wait a minute, we need to add bodies and trained bodies. We need to make sure that the folks that are already there have some idea at a leadership level. But we should not be saying to our current law enforcement agents on the street right now, you also have to become an expert in cybercrime. We need new officers that are experts in cybercrime, extra bodies. And we hope that once we start counting the victims, we can say to Congress, we can say to state legislatures, look, you need to hire more people. We need bodies and training.
Okay, coming back to your money.
Yeah, all money.
Yeah. We'll
Questions
get there.
Questions from the audience? Oh, have we demoralized them all?
There's one.
A common theme that we're hearing is how important it is to execute on, knowing that a cyber crime has occurred as soon as possible. What are your thoughts on GDPR and what it's done in the EU and different regulations that can come into effect here in the United States to help the individual consumer, such as the data consumer protection regulation that's coming up in California in January? What can we do from a regulation perspective?
Great question. And this goes to Senator Warner's comment about the marketplace not holding companies responsible, that we, the consumers, are not. Anyone?
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly seen the impact of GDPR in our business in terms of, the disclosure requirements and organizations thinking much more carefully about processes, controls, and measures to be able to report within the timeframes that are mandated. But it's always a double-edged sword. And the European Union really pushed, and they took a perspective of privacy as primary, right? And that goes all the way into organizations telling, when they're trying to think about security measures, really stepping back from some of them because they're worried that actually it might violate consumer privacy or individual privacies if they put in place certain monitoring capabilities, or if they contract with certain organizations in ways that might violate GDPR. So you always have this tension between a personal or a privacy regime and a security regime. I mean, so that's the fundamental challenge we have to deal with here. I do think, in general, the daylight of it is helpful. At the very least, it forces organizations to be much more thoughtful about how they structure their systems and their data handling requirements and the investments they make. But it also comes at a cost, right? It comes at a cost of additional investments that have to be made and time and effort spent. And what it doesn't address, in my opinion, again, is the other side of that equation, which is the adversary piece. So, on one hand, you've put a lot more sunlight into and a lot more structure at a union level on these issues. But I don't know that I wouldn't sit here and say it's solved all the problems. And then the other challenge, what I would say from my perspective, and you heard it from some of the panelists here, is we have a really fractured regulatory regime in the United States. It's very, very challenging and time-consuming to determine. Every time there's a breach we're involved with, it literally takes dozens or hundreds of man-hours to figure out where, how, and when disclosures need to occur by individual state regulations or authorities. It's just inefficient. So I think to me, it makes sense, like harmonizing that piece of it to some minimum standard that we can all agree to would ease tremendously and put everybody on the same playing field, make things a much more simple space to at least understand what you're operating under. And then you can use that as a launching off point for what else you want to do to become more advanced in this space. But we're so far behind the global community in this. I mean, it's not just the EU, it's other countries were mentioned earlier. We've got some work to do to get there from a legal standpoint.
Other comments on GDPR? I will add, the last time I checked, that the Department of Commerce, which is responsible for enforcement of adhering to it, has not hired a single additional person to do so. So I don't want you to take too much comfort from it, but we're glad to hear that you're trying to comply. Ignore the information I just gave you. Someone is watching you.
I can't speak on the department side, but certainly as an organization, we take it very seriously. We have data privacy officers that focus and regimes for audit in our own company for GDPR, because we operate in that part of the world, obviously, and we're very careful about protecting our clients' information.
Good.
So I think it has some positive, not that we weren't doing that before, but again, now you have a standard that it levels the playing field, and everybody understands exactly what they're signing up for.
Yeah. Any reaction from the victim perspective on GDPR? Are people taking heart from it? Or?
You know, when you give any consumer or small business an acronym like that, the typical American doesn't really even know they have necessarily a state attorney general that they could go to for help. They don't think they can call the FBI on a given day. So I don't even think it's on their radar. They're trying to figure out who's going to listen to me and who can I go to get this fixed. So I think people that are, more involved with the consumer side, or excuse me, the business side of it are paying attention, but I wouldn't say the consumer's paying a lot of attention to it.
I'll say in California, a lot of people are paying attention to it because they did pass a law born out of, I think, legislative fear of a statewide referendum where the public was outraged with all of these data breaches, and it was in response to that. And I will say, at least from California, and the dialogue in California, born out of tremendous frustration that nothing was being done to protect individuals' data. Now, some people say the California regulatory framework is too stringent for businesses to comply with. There have been hearings. There'll probably be some modifications to it. But legislation or regulation born out of total frustration is probably never the right way. But hopefully there will be a national discussion on this, because all the states do require now some form of disclosure when there are breaches, but the protection side of the data, so that perhaps there wouldn't be as many breaches, is where some of these regulations are coming out of. But hopefully with further conversation, they can develop that equilibrium that is companies can comply with, protects consumer data, and helps address this issue, at least in one small piece.
And if I can add too, if you keep sending people breach notifications, the typical consumer, here's another one, oh, you get a free monitoring for a year, but who's going to help me? So GDPR can just cause even more letters to go to someone's house, so they get even more numb to it. But if they don't have a place to go, like 211, you can't do that nationwide, I should say that by now, or fraudsupport.org, if they don't know where to go to get help, just telling them they have more things to worry about without a solution is really frustrating, I would think.
When you just said that you cannot do that nationwide, are you talking about putting
So,
a 211
well, the
number in?
211 number is not live for cybercrime, except for West Michigan, Central Florida, and Rhode Island. We just got funded to take it statewide in New Jersey, North Carolina, Mississippi, and Alabama. But I don't want people to call 211 in Oregon yet and think that they can get help for cybercrime. But we're coming, but we're taking it state by state because of the funding issue, Jim. So.
I do agree. I think there's a numbing effect that we've all seen, even if it's, and it probably would get worse if we had force mandated disclosures that go out. But again, maybe that drives, some of this discussion that we're having today, which is, people eventually getting to the point of saying, we have to get more serious about how we handle this issue, and how do we build, structures and policies that address it in a larger way. And I think, it gets numbing, but it's the only way forward, unfortunately. I like the analogy to the Violence Against Women's Act, which is, again, and again, even though we've all kind of seen it in the media, I'm sure there's a good percentage of people nationwide that see it as reporting, but maybe they're not aware, right, that they've had some privacy breaches in their own personal or commercial dealings, and maybe
we're finding that some victims don't even know what the word cybercrime means, and they don't know they've been a cybercrime victim.
Right.
So we say online fraud a lot just because they don't even know what that means.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, in the end, I don't want you to tell me, I want you to fix it, so.
Exactly.
Well, and so I think it is more, to that point, I do think regimes like that are intended more towards the accountable organizations that are handling privacy data versus, really, if we're being honest, versus making the individuals aware of it. It's really more of a driver for investments in standards of care, on the organizational side of it. And maybe, and then the idea is that will improve over time.
I think there is a question over here.
Hi, my name is Garth Harding. I graduated NYU Tanner School of Engineering 9 years ago with journalism and technical writing. And my question is, on the other, now I was applying to law school, but it didn't work out. But on the other spectrum, I have a question. What about reformation of hacker? FBI does it, reforming hackers to be professional citizens in hacking, and the ethical.
Turning black hats into white hats?
Yeah,
Yes.
an ethical hacker
Yeah.
certificate. What about
Yeah.
hiring more? The hacker is a very long certificate. Turning black hats to white hats.
Yeah, okay.
We're
Good
hearing
question.
that conversation more. I think that's something that I just have started to hear in 2019 more. I've done a lot on the national workforce development side with making sure we have enough people in cyber. And part of the issue with the federal government getting enough people in is it takes months and months and months after you graduate from college to actually get the job. Or it's difficult because people don't even know that those jobs exist. But I have heard now, why don't we find out who the criminals are and try and turn them? But unfortunately, Black Hat has a 10 to 16-year-old program where they bring in kids and they try and turn them into the bad guys from the beginning. So we're going up against, okay, easy free money for $250,000 a month, or do I want to work for the government or for a salary and have to be somewhere from 9 to 5? So I agree with you, but I'm starting to hear more about that.
There's a question over here. Microphone coming from there, okay.
There is, while we're waiting for that, there's programs out, and or actually companies that are, and startups that are trying to take advantage of that ecosystem by almost privatizing or, almost like Uber as a red hat or red team, so where you can have individual contractors who can work on testing environments as independent contractors with their own skill sets and try to widen that field a little bit. Doesn't come without some risks, obviously, but even if we did that perfectly, you're still going to have a gap in resourcing in this space for a long time. The needs far outweigh the available supply of skills and expertise right now.
But we have to start somewhere.
We have to start somewhere.
Yeah, yeah.
My name is Monica Pal. I'm the CEO of a company called 4IQ. We actually look for all this breach data that's floating around on the internet, and we power some of the companies that do identity theft alerting to consumers so they can be alerted that stuff is out there. And we came across a situation where we found an actual leak happening, so a company actually actively leaking information. We informed the company, they shut it down, but that data was already out there. The company didn't, decided they weren't going to report anything. And we actually were not able to report to law enforcement because there's no whistleblower protection. So have you guys heard any conversation around that?
Yeah, ethical disclosure and vulnerability disclosure and even breach disclosure. Again, it's a minefield. And depending on the perspective you take and what industry you work in, it's all over the map. There's some organizations in some industries that are very open to bug bounty programs. They'll pay people to find vulnerabilities or to find disclosed data, and they'll be very upfront about it and open about it. Other organizations take a very, let's say, liability defensive position of anything that is brought to them. They're going to treat as very sensitive and proprietary, and handle it completely differently. I've had experiences in the medical sector in that case, in those kind of cases where you bring that data to certain organizations and they can be very, very, very defensive about it. So I think you're in a really challenged environment, and there's no standard. There's no real. And again, I don't know how you get there without certain regulations to define it, in all honesty. Otherwise, it's going to continue to be a patchwork, and it's going to depend on individual companies and their culture.
Okay, I would just add, given as we've talked about and is apparent, and obviously you know this given your line of work, the problems we're talking about are incredibly complicated. They're across the United States and across the world, really. And what we need, honestly, is effective leadership in the administration and Congress to address this problem. There's not going to be one thing that solves all of this. It's too complicated. But to start to tackle these, to deal with a national privacy standard, a national data breach standard, to make it easier for companies to share information without incurring all this liability that we've been talking about, or all this risk, to shift that by using law to protect people in a more effective way, to break out the checkbook and pay for more law enforcement officers at every level to try to deal with this problem, to have training for them and so on. This is a national problem that is just, we just do not have adequate leadership from Congress or the administration on this right now.
Being the moderator, I'm going to ask the last question. And I'd like each of you to take 30 to 45 seconds to leave us, the audience, with something useful. And that is, what would you advise us to do, either if we're advocating for policymakers, and as individual citizens to inform other people, what should we be doing? Chris, start with you.
I'd like people to share fraudsupport.org with their local law enforcement, with the family and friends that they have. Put fraudsupport.org posters up in your break rooms. I'll send them to you for free. I've got some rack cards out there. On this website, like the UK Action Fraud website, similar, you can learn how to report, recover, and then reinforce your security. And so there are resources available for folks, and we have a one-stop shop before the 211 is nationwide. But go to fraudsupport.org and share that with other people so they know that there is a resource right now to figure out what are the first 4 steps I do after I've been a victim of a romance scam. Here's some help. Here's how you report. So we do have something going positive right now. We've had over 350,000 visitors to that site in less than a year. It just had its 1-year birthday, and it's all paid through private sector. So we have lots of private sector funders also. So it is a public-private partnership. If we all work together, we can make a difference.
Great. Eileen.
Well, as we've been discussing, there's a multifaceted way to solve this problem. We've talked about different aspects of it. We have to define this problem. We have to count these crimes. We have to count the victims. We need to be able to define this problem so our policymakers can see the depth, breadth, and scope of this problem and how it touches every single person throughout this country. Having that information is critical. It's critical for policymakers for changing the laws, for getting more resources, for getting more officers. And we have fundamentally the models to follow. The Violence Against Women Act, I do like that analogy as well. The post 9/11 infrastructure that's been created can be very helpful for driving solutions to these problems and for law enforcement and everyone to be engaged. We have the foundation, but we do need that overarching leadership, funding, and fundamentally, I think it all comes down to counting and understanding this problem with greater specificity.
Yes.
Excellent. Great. Thank you. Jim?
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I would just say real quick, individuals, small businesses, medium-sized businesses, large corporations, governmental organizations, everybody has to understand how valuable all of your data is, all of the stuff that you have on all your different devices, systems, and networks, how valuable that data is to a range of bad actors. And it's important that you prioritize that and think about that and take the basic hygiene steps sort of to make sure that you're protecting your data and invest your money appropriately. I agree completely, and we're doing some work on this at the R Street Institute to try, the cybermetrics problem is huge. There's not agreement on how to count anything, and so there's lots of work that needs to be done there, but that's what your data is really, really valuable.
I'll give my answer in 3 parts. For individuals, get rid of as many passwords as you possibly can. Go to 2-factor everywhere, all the time. For organizations and governmental, I would say public-private partnering and meaningful, interaction and collaboration beyond simple information sharing is going to have to be the norm, and we're going to have to figure out ways to do that effectively to counter these threats. And then I'll say globally, we need to impose more consequences in bigger and more visible ways to have a true deterrence in cyberspace. That's the only way we're going to get to any sort of norming in this arena. That's across the board, from the individual on up, but obviously governments and international multilateral organizations are going to have to think much more seriously about what deterrence actually looks like in cyber to try to stem the rising tide of what's really becoming kind of global warming in cyberspace. In my analogy or my way of thinking, we've got to take some serious countermeasures to really get this under control, or we're gonna have a much more difficult time going forward.
Okay. I want to thank you all, and would you please join me in thanking this great panel?